Welcome, everyone, to the special public meeting. I will call the meeting to order, and I will confirm that we have quorum. We are missing two of our councillors tonight. Councillor Armour is away on vacation, and Councillor Fitzgerald is under the weather. We'd like to start by reading our land acknowledgement statement. I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe under the terms of the Robinson-Huron Treaty No. 61 of 1850 and the Williams Treaties of 1923. We commit to acknowledge, learn, educate, create opportunity, honor sacred places, and take action towards real truth and reconciliation in support of our commitment to walking the path together in respect, peace, and harmony for future generations. And I have a resolution moved by Councillor Schumacher and seconded by Councillor Wiebe. Be it resolved that the special council meeting agenda dated Tuesday, April 26, 2022 be adopted as printed and circulated. All in favor? And that carries. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Seeing none? Okay. Tonight we will be hearing from Paul Lowe's and David Riley from SGL Planning and Design during tonight's public meeting, and we welcome them. I'd like to welcome everyone to this public meeting to present and receive feedback on the second draft of the town's proposed community planning permit bylaw pursuant to Section 34 of the Planning Act. The procedure to be followed in these meetings will be as follows: a brief explanation of the purpose and effect of the proposed bylaw, and any correspondence received to date will be given by staff and invited presenters from SGL Planning and Design. Any members of the public present will then be permitted to ask questions or provide comments respecting the proposed community planning permit bylaw. Council will then have the opportunity to question staff or anyone giving presentations. Once the public meeting is concluded, the input received will be considered with updates to the proposed bylaw as appropriate. Any persons making representation are requested to first state their name and mailing address and record your information on the sheet next to the microphone before you leave the table. Please note, presentations are limited to 10 minutes, and the clerk will ring a bell to give you the 9-minute warning. Please be informed that an appellant must provide an oral submission at the public meeting or written submission prior to the passage of the proposed bylaw. Otherwise, the Ontario Land Tribunal may dismiss the appeal. If you wish to be notified of the passage of the future public meetings for this bylaw, you must file with the clerk a written request for notification prior to the passage of the proposed bylaw. And the notice of public meeting included an explanation of the purpose and effect of the proposed bylaw, and notice was posted in the newspaper and on the town's website. Notice was therefore considered to have been provided in accordance with the provisions of the Planning Act and applicable sections of the Huntsville Official Plan. We will now hear from our planning staff, Richard Clark.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you to all members of the public for attending. So, through you, the report before you is for information purposes only and addresses the second draft of the Community Planning Permit Bylaw, and this is the second public meeting. The first public meeting for this bylaw was held in October, on October the 27th, 2021. In response to comments received at the meeting and in writing both prior to and since, staff and consultants have completed the second draft bylaw and made it available for review on April 7th, 2022. The draft bylaw was published to the town's engagement webpage, www.myhuntsville.ca/CPP Bylaw, along with updated mapping schedules. To support this public meeting, we have invited representatives from SGL Planning and Design, who you've already introduced. And as you are aware, the draft CPP bylaw is a planning bylaw that the town is developing to help implement Huntsville's 2019 official plan. It will affect the entire municipality in terms of its geographic scope and will replace the existing zoning bylaw and site plan control bylaw. When complete, this is possible because the bylaw takes advantage of tools contained in the Planning Act that allow these separate land use controls to be combined into one to help streamline the development approval process. David from SGL will be providing a presentation regarding the second draft of the CPP bylaw and the next steps. David will be reviewing what we've heard about the first draft and the key changes made to address that feedback. Written comments received to date on this second draft of the bylaw have been provided to you. So with your permission, Your Worship, whenever you're ready, I'll throw the floor over to David from SGL.
Thank you, Richard, and hello, Madam Mayor and members of council and everyone here tonight. I'm David Riley, as Richard mentioned, from SGL Planning and Design. And yeah, so we're here to really provide an overview of the key changes. We think at this point everyone's quite familiar with the bylaw itself and the structure and what a CPP bylaw is. So we really just wanted to focus on those changes. So as you know, Kirsten and Richard on staff, we've been working very closely with your staff, and Paul and I and our team at SGL, as well as our team at Dillon Consulting, Justine, Daniel, and Annie, who've been very involved throughout the process. So we'll talk about what the changes are, what we've heard. We'll provide kind of an overview of what the changes are and how we can continue to provide comments and what the next steps are. So this is our little graphic that's within the bylaw itself that explains the change or the difference between the traditional process as it exists today and the community planning permit system process. So you can see the whole idea of creating this bylaw was really to simplify the process, to streamline planning approvals, to within that 45-day time frame. So we're looking at combining zoning bylaw amendments, minor variances, site plan approval, site alteration permits, and tree removal all into one process, the community planning permit process. In terms of where we're at here, we've been in front of everyone many times since the beginning of the project. Then moving on to our technical issues and background review. A lot of community and stakeholder consultation. We prepared the draft bylaw. This is our second draft that's before you. We'll receive comments and then we'll prepare a final draft for approval from here, and then the bylaw would be enacted. So just briefly, what we've heard, there have been a lot of means of participation and communication throughout on the town's website and engagement page. We've had a news feed and newsletters put out. We've had stakeholder meetings, workshops, public open houses, and of course the first public meeting in October. And from all of these events and engagement sessions, we've heard generally overall support for the streamlined process that the bylaw creates, support for shoreline protection measures, and we received a lot of comments. This is probably where the majority of the comments were received about the exemptions to the bylaw, vegetation removal provisions, and site alteration provisions. We also received some questions about some of the precincts. So what's now known as a zone is a precinct within the CPP bylaw. So questions about the waterfront backlot precinct and what is permitted there compared to the existing zoning, and you'll hear me speak about that a little bit further. Questions about how, if you have an existing site-specific zoning approval on your property or on a property, how that's being carried over. We received some comments specific to certain properties and how they're mapped, and of course suggestions for improving the readability of the bylaw. So now let's get into the key changes of the bylaw itself. So of course we started with the background review, went through the best practices. We created the directions report, the first draft bylaw, and now here we have the second draft bylaw. So let's start with one of the big questions or big items that was raised, and that was vegetation removal and site alteration. So vegetation removal, just to define what that is the removal of healthy woody vegetation of at least 1 meter in height, not including trimming or pruning or removal of such woody vegetation if it presents a hazard to life or property. And so anything the way that the bylaw is set out is anything that's not defined as a tree, and we have a definition of a tree, which is actually anything measured at about 1.37 meters in height, so about this high. If it's 20 centimeters in diameter or greater, that's a tree. So anything that is not defined as a tree will not require a community planning permit except where the vegetation is within the natural heritage system and the natural constraint overlay. And I will get to the exemptions on this, but first we'll just address how we're regulating vegetation removal and site alteration, and then we'll deal with the exemptions. So unless you're exempt, a permit's required for vegetation removal and site alteration if you're within the waterfront and urban shoreline precincts, within 30 meters of a wetland or the shoreline of a lake or any watercourse, within the natural heritage system or the natural constraints overlay, within a contiguous area of woodlands that's greater than 4 hectares in size, if you're within the Mary Lake Ridgeline area and the Griffin Bluff Special Policy Area, except where you have an existing approved building envelope, and where site plan control was required as a condition of previous Planning Act approval. So you also need a permit for vegetation removal for clear cutting of woodlands within the natural heritage system and the natural constraints overlay and within the rural precincts. And vegetation removal provisions don't apply to forestry operations. So if you're in the business of forestry, aggregate operations, if you have a licensed operation, as well as public works, as long as you have an approved environmental assessment or equivalent study. And you can vary these provisions subject to a permit. But now, let's get into everything that I just said. It's kind of a broad category of things that we're regulating now, but within there, we have lots of exemptions. So we now understand vegetation removal and what we're regulating, but what is exempt exactly? So starting in the rural and waterfront precincts, not clear cutting of woodlands, so we're not dealing with that, but you're exempt, in the rural and waterfront precincts, except for the clear cutting of woodlands outside of the following. So if you're outside of these areas that I'm reading, you're exempt from obtaining a permit. So within 10 meters of abutting roads, within wetlands, you can't be clearing trees within wetlands, within 30 meters of a shoreline, watercourse, water body, or wetland, within deer wintering habitats, conservation precincts, the Mary Lake Ridgeline and Griffin Bluff Special Policy Area, and areas where site plan control is required as a condition. So you're exempt as long as you're not within these areas. In the urban residential shoreline precinct, you're exempt outside of being within 20 meters of a watercourse or a shoreline for non-trout lake trout lakes, within 30 meters of wetlands of a lake trout lake, and within the natural constraint overlay. In the urban residential and community residential precincts, if you're building a single detached dwelling or accessory structures where you meet the bylaw requirements, you don't need a permit for vegetation removal, or you don't need a community planning permit. You don't need a permit if you're doing site alteration in relation, or vegetation removal in relation to an approved septic system. And you don't need a permit if you're establishing an entrance to your property that's associated with building a single detached dwelling, as long as you have a permit for the entrance. You're also exempt for these activities that are tree removal activities. So if you're cutting down trees for personal use, so this could be wood products, if you're heating your home or you're using it for cooking purposes, recreational uses, or you're making wood-based products, provided that they're not for commercial sale on the property, unless that's something that's permitted on your property. So if you're doing any of these things, you don't need a permit for tree removal. If you're removing dead, dying, or damaged trees that pose a hazard to health or safety or damage to other trees and could become hazardous, you don't need a permit to remove the trees. If you need to accommodate a temporary access for collecting data in relation to a study that you are doing for a larger development proposal, you don't need a permit to remove the trees. And of course, forestry operations don't need a permit to remove trees as long as they're an approved permitted forestry operation. So that's a lot of information there, but we wanted to bring that out front, that's something we heard, and you know, we actually moved the exemption section up in the bylaw and changed the how to read this bylaw section to really say, okay, first thing you need to do is look at if you're exempt from this bylaw, just to really guide people, because if you're exempt, then you can stop reading it and you can proceed with your work. So that's one of the changes here. Within section 1, so I'm just going to go section by section and what's changed. We added an additional paragraph to explain the function of overlays. As I mentioned, we moved the exemptions up to 1.3, and we've clarified that if you have an existing site-specific amendment on your property, so if your property permits 100 residential dwellings, and that was approved in the existing zoning bylaw, and you have zoning that permits that, that is carried over into this bylaw. You still have those permissions. We've prepared some new provisions for dryland boathouses, which were previously not addressed, including a maximum size of 20 square meters. Another comment that we heard was about model homes, and so we added that as a permitted use within all precincts. And secondary residential dwelling units, this was another change coming down from provincial policy that says you have to permit 2 on a property if you're a single detached residential unit, and that is 1 in the main dwelling, and you can have 1 in an accessory dwelling. So we've changed that number in rural precincts to reflect that, because previously it said 1. And we've clarified within these provisions that you can have 1 within an accessory building. In section 3, parking and loading requirements, we reduced some parking requirements related to residential care facilities, food stores, and shopping centers. And it wasn't because of a specific request. We just wanted to be more in line with our research of other municipalities and where they're at in terms of parking rates. So that's more in line with what we're seeing here. And we increased the requirement for waterfront landings in terms of parking. So right now, you need 3 spaces for each lot at waterfront landings, but we added a requirement, and again, this is something that you see in other bylaws, for a visitor space, so 1 extra space for each 3 lots that are being serviced. Within section 4, these are the precinct and overlay provisions, so this is where a lot of the detail is with respect to what would be permitted on properties. We've updated some standards to correct a few errors that we noticed, and we added something that would help add flexibility to the bylaw, and that's the term other similar uses, because we don't want to be in a situation where if a use isn't specifically listed in a bylaw but it is similar and planning staff think, yes, this is appropriate, why are we going through a big amendment process to add this use? This kind of gets around that and allows that flexibility to move forward without creating a large kind of planning application to address something that is actually quite simple. For waterfront precincts, we clarified that any variances are to be carried out in accordance with the standard protection policies of the District of Muskoka official plan. That was one of the comments that we received. And with respect to the waterfront back lot, we received a lot of comments about what's happening to, what are those properties and what about the existing permissions. So those lots are essentially what exists now as the RU or the Rural 2 zone. So we've actually taken those permitted uses and carried them into this bylaw. So now if you're in an RU2 zone now and you're becoming a waterfront backlot precinct, you're going to have the same permissions. There's a new development precinct, and I want to explain this. The term development means that, we're within the Huntsville urban area, for example. It's designated to be, in the official plan, to be developed for urban purposes, so residential. but currently there might be a rural zoning on the property. So in today's world, you would need a rezoning to bring that into conformity with the official plan and apply for maybe a plan of subdivision, and then you'd have lots of reports and studies done. So what the Development Precinct does is that it permits only existing uses that exist today, but it contemplates that development is intended for this property as per the official plan. But the way that you deal with that is that you actually have to amend the community planning permit bylaw, which is a more robust planning process similar to a zoning bylaw amendment, where you'd have people be able to comment in a public forum outside of that 45-day requirement. It doesn't fall under that system, but it's really just ensuring that you can, the town can and the public can comment on these major development applications for these undeveloped lands that are designated for development. We've also added clarification to the natural constraints overlay, that it includes all the features that are within the official plan on Schedule C, as well as within the existing conservation precinct, which is the existing conservation zone. In Section 5, so we moved the definitions to the end of the bylaw. We added new definitions for clear cutting and what footprint is. We removed the definition for good forestry practices, and we have a definition for forest management now. And we updated the definition for short-term rental accommodation. The bylaw, or the schedules to the bylaw, were updated to reflect these changes that we've discussed. For instance, adding the development precinct, refining the overlays to match what's in the official plan. And then we moved a few things to appendices within the bylaw. And the reason we did that is that they can be updated at any time without actually the town undertaking an amendment process to the bylaw. And that's useful because these two items are the study requirements when you're submitting a community planning permit application, what the town can ask in terms of a study, as well as conditions of approval that can be attached to a decision that's being provisionally approved. And really, things change either whether it's based on experience or a different circumstance that might not have come up. So we wanted to allow the town to have flexibility to ask for additional studies up front, or to think of other provisions or conditions of approval that might be appropriate if they're not specifically listed within the bylaw. So in terms of next steps, we've kind of moved through the first several bubbles there, and we're actually at the public meeting, which is the third one from the right. We then move from here to prepare the final bylaw, and then that gets approved after receiving some comments. And so I'm happy, all of us here are happy to take any questions that anyone may have. And of course, for everyone here tonight, if you want to speak tonight, this is the chance to do so, but also you can follow up with written comments or questions directly through Richard or on the website. Thank you.
Thanks, David, for that. Richard, are we going to entertain questions before your presentation, or do you want to do it first?
Thank you, through you, Your Worship. I no longer need to make a presentation. It was just really to introduce that presentation. So that's all I had.
Great. All right, we will open it up to questions, comments, and we will ask you to come to the front to either mic and first state your name and address. And you can line up, or you can, after the first person comes, take a seat next to them.
Thank you, Your Worship. This is on, is it? I think so. My name is Wayne Simpson and Associates, 3-76 King William Street, Huntsville, P1H1E4. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to Council this evening on this important matter. And we appreciate all the work that's gone into the documents to date. It's a horrific exercise, and I'm glad some other consultant was doing this. I do have a concern, a couple of concerns. One is with respect to any intention of the council to consider this bylaw at its May meeting. Right now, Section 6 in the draft bylaw is the section that's going to include all the exceptions, and the consultant mentioned are being carried forward. It's really important to so many of our clients that we see that the exceptions are being brought forward, and that they're brought forward in such a way that their purpose and effect is not lost through any language, or there's no misunderstandings. The difficulty is right now the bylaw, these exceptions were granted by way of amendments to the current bylaw. So we could always go back to the amending bylaw that was passed by council if there's any questions, because sometimes in putting the comprehensive bylaw consolidation on the website, sometimes something can get lost in the translation. It's sort of there's some brevity in the consolidated document that is necessary just to keep the number of pages down. But we're really concerned that this bylaw will actually repeal the current bylaw, the comprehensive bylaw, and by doing so, it'll also repeal all the exceptions that were granted, all the amendments that were made to that bylaw. So, and these exceptions are being incorporated into the new bylaw by references and specifically documentation in Section 6. So we would really love to see a copy of the bylaw, maybe the third draft that would include Section 6, so we can check it against the properties that we've been dealing with in recent years as well, especially to make sure that nothing gets lost, because you know, there would be good opportunity for somebody to have their plans sort of, you know, interrupted, to say the least, and we want to make sure that that's brought forward in the correct manner. One of the things that you might remember in some of these bylaws that are brought forward, you know, an exception might say, notwithstanding Section 417 in the bylaw, such and such. Well, Section 417 will no longer be readily available for anybody to look at to understand what the intent was. And so we just want to make sure that the language is clear. So we would appreciate the opportunity for council to put this back out for further review, and if need be, another public meeting, statutory meeting. I also have a couple of concerns that I can share with the staff directly with a couple of the land use schedules or the precinct maps. One that came to mind is the Clublink property on the north side of Highway 60, the O'Meara Golf Course. Its current designation is intended to accommodate some residential development in pockets of land in and amongst the golf course, but the way it's been drafted is that the whole of the golf course, the back 9 of the golf course would all be legal non-conforming, and that the drafting exercise is in error. And I also wanted to comment that the North Granite Ridge Golf Course, that was when the official plan was adopted, we appealed the designation on that property to the tribunal, and there was an agreement, minutes of settlement, that saw the land use designation on the golf course property, on the developable portion that's surplus to the golf course, being changed from open space to community residential. And we would like to see the community residential precinct designation applied to the property. And one other thing that really does cause me some concern is, excuse me, I don't have COVID. I've got allergies, and amazingly to maple trees. But anyway, one of the things that's a concern to us, and has always been a concern, is the legal fabric that's incorporated into the district's website, the GeoHub and the interactive mapping. Council may recall just a short time ago, I was in front of the council looking at for a zoning amendment over on Deerhurst Drive for a property owned by the Berkovics. And it was a property where the property was zoned as being in the floodplain, and it wasn't, and council saw fit to change the zoning of the property from natural resource to shoreline residential. That hasn't been translated into the zoning schedule as well. But the property fabric overlay, even though it was changed in February to include impact mapping from both 2020 and 2021, not all of that's been corrected. So when we look at that roadway, the property lines run through the center of most of the houses. So the legal fabric that we're relying upon to understand the precincts and understand the constraints, it's not all that reliable. So we really would like to see an interactive map that allows us to go in, to look at a particular property, to see the precinct category, to look at the constraints mapping applicable to that particular property, and to look at what exceptions might have been brought forward for that property. It's just a horrendous exercise now trying to sort through these things, and my attempt to do that on the website sort of met with failure to the extent that it was a very slow and arduous process, even though I have a very high-speed computer and whatnot. So that's maybe just part of the mechanics of the IT department. But anyway, in principle, I guess we commend the staff for it. There's probably some other things we'll comment on, but most importantly, we want to see that the Section 6 is completed and made known to the public so we can review it in detail before the bylaw is passed. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wayne, and thanks for all of your comments and for going through the draft bylaw and finding things that need addressing. Just to summarize, what you'd really like to see is a draft 3, though.
Yes, very much so. Thank you. With some of the schedules, and we can get back to the planning department, but the things in the schedules that we picked up on. I'm not quite as colorblind as my wife believes I am, because I find it difficult to look at all these different shades of reds and purples and things like that. But I think when we zoom in on the interactive mapping and we start to look at the precinct, I was looking at one and it was a big purple blob, which is fine, but it didn't tell me right on that. Well, what is the purple blob? Is it recreational resort residential, or is it something else? And so you'd have to flip back to a legend, and then you're looking at a legend with all sorts of color schemes. And anyway, it's just some of the mechanics are difficult to wade through, but I would love to see a draft 3. Thank you.
Okay. Richard, David, Paul, any comments back, or are you just recording some of... Everybody's afraid to cough these days.
Sorry, I thought David was coming up to the microphone. Yeah, just in regards to some of the comments we heard, there will be no Section 6 in this bylaw. Instead, we've introduced language in Section 1.8 that explains that all of the site-specific exceptions, all of the minor variants that would have taken place under previous bylaws will be carried forward despite those bylaws being repealed. So that's how we were going to address that. So there would be no Table 6 that you're hearing about. There was an interactive map that was available to the public so that you could really zoom in from property to property and see what the precinct is. You really just had to click on the property just to see what the proposed precinct was. And yeah, just to say, if comments that Mr. Simpson has about site-specific things, we'd be happy to receive those, and maybe we would put those together in a table, and it might be something that staff looks at, or it might be something that goes back to committee to decide on whether or not there's an appropriate change to be made. But I think that's all I would say to that.
Okay. I'm going to alternate, and I'll go to this mic next.
Richard Herron, Box 5090, Huntsville, main station. I also want to see a third draft, and I want to see all the schedules and all the details that are going to be there, all the map overlays, everything. I have a number of little questions, so I'll ask a bunch of them, and then I'll let someone else come up, and I'll come back later, probably for some things. The first one is, it sounds to me like there's going to be lots of level 1 and level 2 permits being issued for people who want to do little bits of this or little bits of something else. So my question is that information going to be made available to the public so we know who's applying for what that for the neighbors might wish to object to? It also provides us with a chance to see why they've been accepted or why they've been rejected, and that's needed from my point of view for accountability on your part and on the part of the managers who are going to be granting these permits for accountability. Otherwise, you're going to leave yourself open to comments from the general public about bias and favoritism and all those sorts of things. So you need to think about that. I didn't see it mentioned anywhere, but that's something you need to think of. The next one just on my list here. I was not aware of the natural heritage system for Muskoka until I happened to be going through some of the documents and it popped up. And it turns out most of my land happens to fall into it, which was news to me. So my first question is, what exactly is it and what was its purpose when it was created by the Muskoka board or district, I guess?
Richard?
Sure. Thank you, through you, Your Worship. So I think what the member of the public is referring to is the Muskoka heritage areas. So these are areas that are identified in the district official plan as being ecologically sensitive. They've identified them throughout Muskoka, and there are a few of those Muskoka heritage areas in Huntsville. The big one that I can think of is the Big East River. It follows the entire length of the river until it meets Lake Vernon, and then there are other wetlands, and it's the feature and areas around them that have been called heritage areas by the District of Muskoka. So because it's in the district official plan and it needs protection in the district official plan, all the local municipalities have to provide protection for those areas in our official plan, and now the community planning permit bylaw would also have protection for those natural heritage features.
Follow-up question. Is there a document that describes all this in more detail and also provides a map to show the exact boundaries and justification as to why this point was in and that point was out?
Richard?
Okay, so through you, Your Worship, yeah, there are schedules in both the district official plan and the town official plan that show those areas mapped. So I can tell you in the town official plan, it's mapped on Schedule C of the official plan. And I believe and I might ask, if I get it wrong, I'll throw it over to Kirsten, but I believe the district official plan has an explanation of what Muskoka heritage areas are, why they're identified, why they need to be protected. So you could look in that document for that information. And sorry, I should say
Okay.
that language is also in the town's official plan, but it comes from the district official plan.
I understand, in order to understand why the town's doing it, I need to understand why the district's doing it.
Okay.
My issue with tree cutting is not so much individuals cutting trees for their own use, but the biggest damage, and it's the area that I think you need to concentrate on the most, is the aspect that might be called forestry. I've lived on my property since I was 3, and in that time there have been 6 instances of which so-called forestry operations have done substantial cutting and damage to surrounding territories. None of these have been done by foresters. None of these have been done by certified tree markers. They've all been done by the guy down the street who has a chainsaw and a small bulldozer and a truck, who goes in and cuts down the trees he wants, and he makes a hollow road where he wants and then leaves. And I noticed, maybe, I don't know if I understood or not, but it sounds to me like you have exempted forestry from all these provisions, but yet nowhere did I see a definition of who was a forester or under what conditions forestry could be applied. Could I go and call myself a forester? I've got 360 acres of bush. I've got a chainsaw, I've got a tractor. I don't have a truck, but I'm sure I could rent one somewhere. Would that allow me to forest operation in my bush?
Richard, is there a definition of forester in the bylaw?
Thank you, through you, Your Worship. There is a definition of both forestry operations and forest management in the bylaw. And the only thing to also note is forest operations are use that is permitted in certain precincts. So where that use is permitted and you're doing something that's forestry, meets the definition of forestry, then it's exempt from the community planning permit bylaw. So that's the clarification I would provide there.
Okay, thank you. I'll step aside and let some other people ask questions.
Richard Clark, just before we get to the next one, did you want to just touch on the first question, the difference between the Class 1 and 2 permits and what the public notification is?
Sure, I can do that. So through you, Your Worship, the Class 1 permit and the Class 2 permit are both staff approvals. The difference is the Class 1 permit is basically for any development that meets all of the provisions in the bylaw. So no variation of any of the provisions, and then it's a straight Class 1 permit, staff approval, and there's no notice required for that. Class 2 permit would be a permit that where someone is proposing to vary some of the standards of the bylaw. And the bylaw sets the threshold for what type of variations could be staff approved. So if it falls within that threshold, then it could be a staff approved variation. And there is a notice provision for those types of permits. So basically the proposal would be to post that information on our webpage, and if there are any comments from anyone about that variation, we would consider those through the review process. And I'm just going to say, or is there anything else to add?
There's also a this is working. Yes, it is. There's also a requirement for a Class 2 permit for a sign to be posted on the property.
Thanks for that. We'll go back to this mic now.
Hello, my name is Jack Sentinel. I own the property at 36 Brunel Road. Thank you very much, Your Honor, councillors, staff, and SGL for allowing me to speak. I have a couple of questions, nothing major, but I would like clarification on page 74 of the community planning permit. So I currently have about 0.4 acres on that lot, and it's currently zoned R3. Now, when I was talking with one of your planning staff today, they had me go to the interactive map, and under the new zoning, I would be urban residential. Now, under R3, you were required 15 feet, according to R3, you had 15 feet of frontage in order to build. But in the new, if I'm reading this right, the lot frontage for full services is now 30 meters. Well, none of the lots in town are 100 feet wide going to the river, or very few of them. So what ramification does that have, or am I reading this wrong?
Thanks for your comment. There's a few different urban shoreline precincts, urban residential precincts. There's urban shoreline, urban low density, urban medium density, and urban high density. And just wondering, did you notice on the plan which category you fell in?
Yeah, I'm urban shoreline.
You're urban shoreline.
I'm on the water.
Yeah, and so and you have Yeah, so, and I think the existing zoning is also that. So in the existing zoning bylaw, if you have a new lot that's being created on the shoreline, the zoning says that you have to be 30 meters. But if you're an existing lot, then you're existing and it's permitted as is.
Okay.
So there's no concern with your lot.
Okay, so now that that seems to have been clarified, under the urban shoreline, a lot of the land use has been removed. Under R3, and not that I ever plan on doing anything with this, but this is property that will go to my sons eventually. I see that the uses you're allowed, and if you wanted to put, right now I'm allowed up to 4 dwellings on that property, and it is 0.4 acres, so it's a considerably large piece of property with 115 feet of frontage. But under the new zoning, it seems like you lose that. So, because everything's being put together under urban shoreline, where we had individual categories before, it's like it's all being clumped in. So I'm going from medium density to low density. Am I reading that right?
Thank you. Through you, Your Worship. I think it's, I think you raise a good point. I think, and I know you've reached out to planners in our
I did
office
today.
already.
Yes,
today.
that actually was after, I've never seen that map until the planner showed me today.
Yeah.
And then when I went and read all the material, it's like, that's quite a change
Yeah.
from an existing use.
Yeah. So I think that you should continue those discussions with that planner and myself,
Okay.
and we can look into those things.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there can be site-specific things that we would look at with you, and we're happy to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yep.
Great. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jack. Mary Jane?
Okay, Mary Jane Smith, 1778 Atwell Road, Huntsville, P1H 2J2. So I'd like to say we appreciate the effort in attempting to input. I know, as I said, I'm too short. Thank you. Sorry. Okay, do I have to start all over, or are we good? Okay. Anyway, I'll start from here. We appreciate the effort in attempting to input some of the suggestions that have come from the public in regard to changes to the CPP bylaw. We are still in opposition of the CPP bylaw for the following reasons. So our first concern, which we've mentioned to the planning staff, is that this bylaw was introduced at the start of COVID-19. At a time when people were concerned about their health, their employment, and their families. We weren't looking at what was going on in the town. We're more concerned with ourselves at that point. The town, we felt, should have provided information within the residents' tax bills about this CPP bylaw, because anyone we've talked to knows nothing about it. So we don't feel that your strategy for getting this out to people has actually worked. We also felt that this should have been a clear-cutting bylaw focused on the developers and not the private landowners. Just in particular, what's happening in the town core seems to be what has really brought this forward. The objectives of the CPP bylaw include regulating vegetation removal and site alteration as part of the development approval process to appropriately consider environmental protection and tree preservation where appropriate. So even in your own statements, it says developmental approval process, not the landowner that's cutting their firewood just to heat their home. We still have problems with your vegetation removal and site alteration, still not adequately applied in the exemptions for rural landowners to continue to live their way of life. Find they're still too stringent, especially the meaning. So vegetation removal means vegetation at least, and I'm going to say it in feet, so 3.2 feet in height. I said this might make sense for an urban lot, but not a rural acreage. The same with site alteration. It means the results in a change to the landform by more than 1 foot over an area of 100 square feet. Might make sense in the urban, but not in the rural acreage. Also, your 2.11.1 placement of fill less than 7 cubic meters. I said this is not adequate in the rural area with acreages, since the CPP is now allowing recreational trails to be made on your rural property under the second draft. And so quoted, the bylaw aims to help staff implement the natural constraint protection policies contained in our updated 2019 official plan, blah, blah, blah. So right now, if someone does a study on their property, because the town has said that they need to do it in order to get a consent or a zoning or a minor variation, they go ahead, they pay the money, they get the consultant, they get the form, all the forms done, they give it to the town approves it, and that's it. It doesn't get put into the official plan. It doesn't change the official plan. So the next person going to do it is still going to have those same regulations of the official plan on that Schedule C. It's not going to, they need to add whatever the environmental study that person has done to your official plan's Schedule C, so that it doesn't, so that your Appendix A, I think, should stipulate that that would happen, that those studies would be added to your Schedule C and official plan. Otherwise, what's the sense in us doing it if you're not even really acknowledging it on paper? And that's after you've approved it, right? And other than that, that's all I've got to say right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Jane. And I don't think you had an actual question. I think those were all comments, and thank you for them, and we have them in writing as well. So, who's next?
Hi, Ryland Davis, 80 Haynes Road, Huntsville, Ontario. I forget my postal code. I will try to find that. My question I find more is, for tree cutting, I just want to, not everybody can read a bylaw like this. I feel like we need to simplify it for people. You know, if there's the hydro lines that does hydro have to now go get a permit to cut down the tree that I need taken down? And how will this affect like our current projects that are going on? Like I know there's projects like, I'm thinking the one on Haynes Road where the Fairburn Development was going and where like New Fresco's going. How's that going to affect those projects? Because they're like halfway through these stages. Are they going to be like grandfathered into the old clause and then new ones start like that? And also just to speak, I think the one size fits all feels like there's a lot of one size fits all. There's very drastic differences if you live on Haynes Road or if you live out in Aspidon or down in Utterson. I feel like maybe that needs to be addressed in the bylaw. Thank you.
Richard, do you want to talk about the developments that are underway and how this will affect those?
Yeah, sure. So through you, Your Worship, so I can address that. I can also address just quickly that question about the hydro lines. For things that would be exempt because they're allowed under other legislation, we did not cover them in our exemptions, but removal of trees within the hydro corridor we wouldn't regulate. There would, so similarly, if trees were being removed in association with a cadastral survey by an Ontario land surveyor, no exemption. But rather than list them all, we were just, we didn't do that. But they would not require removal permits. And then as far as the question about existing or pre-existing approvals, so there is an exemption if someone has a site plan approval then they're exempt from requiring or having a new permit. But as soon as they made an amendment to that site plan, then they would have to go through this process. So that's what I would say to that. And also just to clarify, I think you heard earlier from Mr. Simpson about pre-existing approvals, site-specific approvals like zoning amendments. Those would be carried forward also. So anything that has gone through a process, the principle has been that we would honor those previous planning approvals, if that helps.
Thanks for that. Does that help, Violet?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I just wanted to know like if they, up there, if they have to start the process or if they should have to restart the process.
Okay. Richard, go ahead.
I have a question for Maria Laurie, 884 Ravenscliff Road. I don't know the postal code, but it should be easy to look up. She's asking, is there a paper copy of the CPPS bylaw with the schedules, maps, etc., available in the library? And we're talking about a printed copy. If not, there should be, and there should also be a large poster of the cover on the door so people know it's in there.
That's an easy question. Do we have a copy at the library?
So through you, Your Worship, there is no copy at the library. It is a draft document, so we weren't putting it in the library. If people do want a printed copy, we can do that for them, but there is a small fee for that service. Otherwise, it's available online, and if people have that capability, they can print it themselves, obviously, but it is not in the library.
One of the problems that's already been alluded to is virtually nobody knows about this. And saying that things are available online is fine as long as people know they have to go online to get it. But if they don't know it's there, they don't know to get it. So I think at a minimum there should be a copy, a paper copy in the library so people can look at it along with the maps. Okay, back to me. There's a few little questions here. I'll start with one. One of the exemptions for tree cutting is for trees that are a hazard to property or health or humans or whatever the wording was. So let's assume I cut down a tree because I think it's a hazard. And my neighbor comes along and says, no, it wasn't a hazard at all. Whose opinion rules? Or is it yours? Does someone come out from town and look at the stump and say, yes, that tree was a hazard, or no, it wasn't? What are we going to do about something like that? All of these little, I won't call them loopholes, but little details need to be ironed out ahead of time.
Richard, your response?
So through you, Your Worship, so I believe the question was about, so if trees were claimed to be a hazard tree and so someone was claiming an exemption because of that. So I think that's really an enforcement matter. I think what we would hope is people, if they were uncertain, they would talk to us. If it could just be a matter of taking a picture, and then we'd be able to say, yeah, that's not going to cause you a problem. We don't want to be going to every property and making and being overly restrictive on rural landowners. So the benefit of the doubt is going to be given quite a lot. And I think from an enforcement perspective, if there was any concern about trees being removed that were claimed to be hazard, it's always difficult. And it's not always easy, but the evidence is usually there on the ground, and hopefully that would be how we would enforce that. But we're not going to be, in practice, going and looking at every tree. So we would work with landowners. If it looks like it's a hazard tree and they're able and they have a question about it, they can give us a picture, and I think that would be fine. But for the most part, I think we'll give the benefit of the doubt that if it's dead or dying or damaged, that it would qualify for the exemption. If that helps.
If I could just add, Madam Mayor, the exemptions are quite broad, so it's not just for removal of dead and dying trees, for all personal use. So as Richard said, the municipality's not going to be coming out. If it's for personal use, it's personal use. And there's also a broad range of other uses that could be had for it. So the exemption is quite broad, and it's not going to be something that a matter of having to go out and enforce every single cutting of tree. Not at all.
Most of my property used to be in RU2, Rural 2, which included a lot of things, but it also included forestry. And someone said, no, nothing has changed for those Rural 2 lots being moved to waterfront backlot. Well, in fact, forestry's been taken out. So from that point of view, my 350 acres of hardwood bush is now essentially valueless because it can't be cut, except for firewood for personal use by me. So there is some changes. Most of these comments and questions now apply to waterfront backlots that were created from Rural 2. The first one is that even though we don't have waterfront, we're being lumped into vacant waterfront property. And from an assessment point of view, it seems that that is likely to increase the assessed value of the property, even though it has no waterfront. And to me, that seems a little bit unreasonable. So part of my comment is, I'm not sure who chose the name waterfront backlot, but it seems to me it would be more realistic to call it Rural 2 like it was, because most of those backlots have no waterfront. So why are you calling them waterfront? That's just going to cause the assessors to have to make some sort of value judgment regarding whether there's waterfront or no waterfront. And there's not a whole lot of those properties, so they may have trouble coming up with a numeric model of it. My second question is a little bit more pointed and factual. If I were to ask you to complete the following question, or the following statement with a number of bullet points, how would you complete it? A lot is a waterfront backlot if it meets one of the or more of the following criteria. What are the criteria?
Richard?
I notice this because none of the precincts have definitions indicating what the criteria are.
So through you, Your Worship, the simple answer is because it's designated in the official plan. So the official plan talks about that area of land, 150 meters from water bodies, is part of the waterfront designation. And if a property is, so a lot of these RU2 lots were within that area, and that's why they were called RU2, so a rural backlot to the waterfront. So the official plan calls these areas waterfront backlots, so that's why we made that change. One other just point of clarification, forestry operations were not a permitted use in the rural 2 zoned lands, so that's not a change. And I don't know if there's anything else I could answer to help, but hopefully that clarifies. It's basically it's a designation in the official plan, and there's also a table in section 1 of the bylaw that we added to try and clarify what each of these precincts are. So that that table hopefully does do that.
So if a waterfront backlot does not contain any, oh, hang on, it's where the definition here. Muskoka heritage areas, would having a Muskoka heritage area in your property automatically make it a waterfront backlot if it's not within 150 meters of the water?
So through you, Your Worship, would you like me to answer that?
Yes, please.
So the two are independent. So if the property is within 150 meters of a water body, and that's a defined term, then it could be a waterfront backlot. So it doesn't matter about the Muskoka heritage features that it contains or not.
It's just the distance from the water body.
Yeah, so properties that touch the waterfront
Okay.
or are within 150 meters could be waterfront backlots. So there's criteria in the official plan about that.
Okay. So a follow-up question is, if you're going to apply buffers and boundaries to water bodies, why do you include the entire property instead of just limiting it to the 150 meters within the waterfront? Because in my case, what you're doing is for a piece of land, maybe 2 acres, that is within 150 meters of the waterfront, an entire 300 acres is being classified as waterfront backlot, when it's really rural. It's rural, undeveloped bush.
Richard?
Sorry, yes. So these are all great questions. And just one more point of clarification through you, Your Worship. So the 150 meters is what could make your property a waterfront backlot. And then the reason we have these provisions is those waterfront backlots are usually going to be highly visible from our water bodies. And some of them stretch quite far, but they could contain a very sensitive hill or slope feature.
So it's not the ecology you're protecting, it's the scenery.
Part of the reason we do, yeah, it is character, and it's maintaining a ridge line around some of our lakes, and that's why things like forestry operations weren't traditionally permitted in those areas. So those are the reasons for some of those waterfront backlot policies. You don't want to overdevelop your water bodies.
So
That's the reason.
okay, so even if I was to split my lots up such that 2 lots were not within 150 meters of the river, they would still be classed as waterfront backlots because they have the Muskoka heritage designation, wherever that term is, Muskoka heritage area across it. That would make them a waterfront backlot.
So
Go
through
ahead,
you,
Richard.
Your Worship.
Yeah.
So it's independent of the Muskoka heritage area. It's about proximity to the water bodies and whether or not that property is, we use the term whether it's functionally related to the water body. So if you did apply to sever your lands, there are lot requirements that you'd have to address, and those are outlined in our new waterfront precinct provisions. So they're, yeah, and they all come from our official plan policies that deal with waterfront protection of waterfront character, sensitive features in waterfront areas. So that's the reason we have these policies.
So ultimately, it's coming down to your decision as to whether something is a sensitive area or not. And my other question would be, follow-up question is, what is a functionally related to? What's the definition of that? Is it is a bush on a hill functionally related to the waterfront because it's right beside the waterfront, or because there's a stream going down, or because, well, the same owner, I guess you could call that functionally related to. But if that's the definition, then every lot is related to every other lot from a functional point of view.
Thank you, through you, Your Worship. I was just, we were just discussing it. So functionally related is not defined. It is terminology used in our official plan. It is being carried forward, and in practice, it means what we would say is that if the property is going to be visible from the lake because of slope, then it would be functionally related. If there were alterations on the property that could impact water quality because it slopes down to that water body, it would be functionally related. And if there was any question about whether or not something was functionally related, that's why there would be the ability to do technical studies to confirm whether or not there is a functional relationship. So that's how we would handle that kind of thing, if it helps.
Well, if you're going to use those definitions, it means that every parcel of land that is upslope of a water body should be in that waterfront backlot category, regardless of how far it is away from the water. Because water eventually goes from even the highest point in Muskoka down to the water.
Karen?
Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Do you mind if I speak?
You want to make a response?
Well, I'd like to just sort of comment to that.
Yep. Yeah. I'm going to, Councillor Weed would like to just comment on the last presenter, Larry. Can you hang on one sec? We're probably out of procedure here, but go ahead,
Sorry,
Councillor
thank you.
Weed.
I just wanted to circle back to some of the comments that were made, and I'm wondering if maybe striking to the heart of it would be, the question is, how I'm understanding it is, would there be circumstances where a lot owner, a property owner, could apply for like a dual zoning because of the vastness of a piece of land that has a small frontage on a water body? Would there be a process, or could there be a process where they could sort of split the zoning, if you would, to have the areas that clearly are functionally related to the water body, but then define those from the remaining lands that would be well away from that specific water body? Is there something to that?
Go ahead,
Through
Richard.
you, Your Worship, that's a great question. So there would be a process. You could apply to have an amendment to the bylaw. If you were proposing some use on your property that's not permitted within lands that we say are the waterfront precinct, you could propose a change to the precinct so that you could use your lands for that purpose. So that is always an avenue, and we would look at the official plan for our guidance in that regard to see whether or not that would be appropriate.
Okay, thanks for that.
Okay. Larry, I think you were next.
Larry Ross, 36 Goldie Street in Huntsville. I'd like to thank staff and consultants that worked on this. A lot of work went into it, and it's a very difficult task. So I think generally speaking, it's a good document, but I have some concerns related to tree clearing and also site alteration. So I wondered, would it be possible to flip back in the slides just to a previous slide related to, I think it was entrance permits?
So through you, Your Worship, we can do that, but it won't necessarily be visible on the live stream. It's just going to show up here, but that's fine. We can do that.
Sure, that's fine.
Which exemptions?
Yeah, it had to do with entrance permits.
I think this is the one.
Yeah, so this is related to site alteration or vegetation removal. So I had a discussion at the open house the other night, and we talked about the fact that someone might take out an entrance permit, but then also require a community planning permit for what happens behind the entrance. So can someone clarify, does this mean then that someone can put in a driveway and also put in fill? As long as they have an entrance permit, they don't need an additional permit for work done beyond the roadway? Because when I asked the question the other night, I got a different answer.
Through you, Your Worship, just to answer that question, so the entrance permit itself, which is the permit that would be granted to allow for entrance onto a municipal right-of-way, that would be exempt. If the lands beyond on the private property contain natural heritage features, natural constraints, then then you would have to look at that and look at the relevant provisions. So if there's a wetland on the other side, then you would need to go through and get a permit for that. We would work with our operations department so that they're aware of where those natural constraints are. And if there's any question about whether or not the entrance permit should be granted because of a constraint, then we would have those discussions. If there are no natural constraints, then those provisions don't apply. You get your entrance permit, you could do your site alteration beyond it. So I think that's hopefully clarifies the issue for you.
Well, it appears to me then that statement is not correct because it says to establish a vehicular entrance for a single detached dwelling where an entrance permit has been obtained. My understanding is that's an exemption. So what that statement says is you don't need a permit to do site alteration or vegetation removal. But now you're saying you do in addition to the entrance permit because there might be a wetland?
So through you, Your Worship, I was just looking for the exact language. This is just a paraphrase of the language. So it is more or less the same language, though, so that's okay. But yeah, so I would say that what we are trying to do is say that if you've got an entrance permit, an existing entrance permit or a new entrance permit, and you're doing site alteration related to that, you don't need an approval. But beyond that area, for if you're going to be doing site alteration within a natural constraint area, then those provisions would apply, and we would need to look at those. So I don't know if that's if that answers the question. Is there? I would just throw it open. Is there any clarification from anyone else on that?
Yeah, just to clarify, if it's a single detached house and you're looking for the driveway access to it, no matter what, you don't have to have a permit. But to Rich's point, if there's site alteration beyond that and it's in a natural feature, then you'd have to have the permit.
Okay, so if you're building a house, that means you've applied for a building permit, then it's okay.
Yes, single detached home.
But you can't put in a driveway without a site alteration or a community planning permit.
You don't need it for the driveway.
Right.
You don't need it for the single detached home. If you're doing, to Rich's point, if you're doing site alteration beyond that, back part of the property, as part of you doing that, then you would need it.
Okay.
And there's a wetland there, or you're within 30 meters of the shoreline.
Okay.
That's when you have to do it.
Well, and this is just an example, I think, and I appreciate the efforts you made to change the wording of the tree clearing because, it was very problematic to begin with, but I think part of the issue here is I don't understand it now because there's so many loopholes and exemptions and exceptions, and my concern is if something's not clear, it's going to create an administrative nightmare. The town's going to have to hire 2 new people just to answer phone calls about, do I need it, and just sort out, a previous speaker said, what if someone says, oh, so-and-so cut a tree down and we need to sort that out. So, I think a lot of this stuff has been driven because of clear cutting in the urban area and potentially in the waterfront area. But it seems to me that getting into, the rural area and trying to control all of these activities, I don't think there's a problem in the rural area. So I think in a sense, this is a solution for a problem that doesn't exist. And I think it's going to cause all kinds of administrative nightmares. I think you're going to need more staff. And I just really don't see the need for it. So I think it's too broad. The site alteration specifically, I mean, what can you do? One truckload of material? I mean, if somebody wants to put in a garden and bring two truckloads of topsoil in, they need a permit? I mean, it just, I don't know, it doesn't make sense to me, so. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Larry. We'll go over to the other mic next. Go ahead. Ma'am, go ahead.
Carolyn Wood, I live at 1750 Old Muskoka Road, and my first question is under vegetation removal.
Beautiful.
Okay. Under vegetation removal, it says within a contiguous area of woodlands greater than 4 hectares. First question, please explain exactly what you mean by contiguous.
Good question. Richard.
So through you, Your Worship, so contiguous in relation to a woodland is, we're just talking about a woodland when you look at it from a bird's eye perspective. If that woodland, regardless of property boundaries, is overall greater than 4 hectares, then that would make it a woodland, a contiguous woodland area over 4 hectares. So you kind of have to look from above and forget about property boundaries and just look at the area of that woodland. So that's what we're trying to talk about there. If there was a break, like a road, that would be a break. So it's not a contiguous woodland. So I hope that helps to clarify that.
Okay, that leads to my next question. So if I read this, okay, greater than 4 hectares. So we own over 90 acres. So if my neighbor owns, I think, an acre, so 4 hectares, 10 acres. So if they own less than 10 acres, they can cut all the trees they want. But any area on my property that is greater than 10 acres, I have to come to you and get a permit to cut a tree down. So I could have 10 lots beside me of 10 acres, as far from what I understand this, clear cut, but within my 100 acres, because I happen to have an area, which mine there is clearing. If I had an area bigger than 12 acres, I have to go get a permit from you. That doesn't make sense.
Maybe I just clarify on that. No, you don't. Not for personal use, for heating, cooking, recreational use, making any wood products, and removal of dead and dying trees, building a single detached home.
I've read your exceptions, but, okay, for instance, we have a big long driveway. So if I cut some trees so I can see my gate, so I can see if you drive up, you're saying that I shouldn't go cut those trees because it might be in an area bigger than 10 hectares or 10 acres, right? Is that what you're saying?
If it's all for personal use, you can cut the trees.
So it's my property, so for me, personal use is, my whole property is personal use if I want to cut a tree down.
As long as it's not clear cutting and it's for personal use, you're allowed to do it.
So you're saying as long as it's not clear cutting?
As long as it's not clear cutting and it's for
So-
personal use.
okay, so-
If it's not commercial use, unless it's a forestry operation. So if it's a forestry operation, you can do it for commercial use on your property.
Okay, so so where I live was homesteaded in 1918. It was made into farmland, cattle. You could see from one end to the other. We've owned it for 30 years. So a lot of it has grown up, but we still have clear areas, okay? So basically, if I want to cut any of it that's not in the clear areas, I need a permit, or I don't, or I can cut it?
If it's, again, if
Because
it's,
obviously anything I cut's going to be for my personal use, right?
and if it's for personal use, then you can cut it. As long as it's not clear cutting. So if you're not clearing the whole forest down, and if it's for personal use.
So at
you
what
can
point
cut
do
it.
we call it clear cut? Like we have fields that are growing in, so if I go and cut and widen them out into
The
10
de-
acres instead of 5 acres, is that clear cutting? I'm just restoring what was there as a field. Just like that's where it's questionable. When is it you want one and when don't you want one? to me, that's not totally clear.
Do you want me to answer?
Sure.
The definition is the removal that exceeds an area, a contiguous area of over 1 hectare. That'd be clear cutting.
Pardon?
Over 1 hectare. So a contiguous area over 1 hectare would be considered clear cutting.
Okay. But I don't think that specifies anywhere what your definition of clear cutting is, does it?
Yeah, it is. It's on page
Page 107.
page 107.
So if I have an area that's 5 acres of woodland, I can go cut in there without a permit. But if I happen to have an area, which is true on all over my property, you could do aerial views. I have areas that are over 10 acres or over 4 hectares. So in that case, I would need a permit to cut a tree there, but I wouldn't need where I have 5 acres.
You want to respond? No, if you cut an area, so you're cutting all the trees in an area greater than a hectare, then you need a permit.
But not if I go cut a single tree.
Not if you cut a single tree, but if you want to cut all the trees down in that hectare, then you need a permit.
So that's what this applies to.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you just want to cut a tree, or you want to cut 100 trees, as long as it's not a hectare, you can do that for your personal use.
Okay.
Okay?
Because what I didn't understand about this is go up Muskoka Road 3, like I remember years ago, hundreds of acres, thousands of trees cut down. And to me is, why are you concerned if I cut a few trees down on my property when actually there's thousands more now than when I bought it 30 years ago, right? So there's where I don't follow the rationale. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Hi, I have more of, I guess, a question. So we're coming up to a municipal election coming up in October, and how long are we expecting this to take before we can say it's a bylaw? You know, if we have the potential to going into a lame duck session come August, so would that be something where we have to wait for the next council? Does this expire and we have to start from scratch? Or does, is there certain powers granted to, I believe I read like the CAO has certain powers if we have a lame duck session. So I guess I'm not sure if that's more of a question for the planners or for the clerk's department, but what is the timeline, and are we expected to have this council ratify it? Are we going to wait till after the election, or are we going to have to start fresh when a new council's sworn in?
Go ahead. What's our anticipated month to pass this bylaw?
So that's a great question. So through you, Your Worship, we can move this forward in May's cycle for planning committees to bring it forward to council for that month. June, the plan is for us to have this bylaw approved during this term of council. So that's the goal we're working towards.
Sure.
If we, for example, like I know we were talking potentially going into a third public meeting or a third draft to this, does that delay the start time there, pushing back our time to wanting the council to approve it?
Maybe I could put the clerks on the spot. Does the change in council actually affect this process going forward? I don't believe it does, so let's get the official answer, though.
It would not. It would not affect this.
So a change of council doesn't affect this. We can do anything, we're council.
Okay, my name is Maria Laurie, and good evening, everyone. I do not mean to be disrespectful. I just can't stand in place for any length of time, so forgive me for sitting down. What I come away with from listening to everybody and for coming to previous meetings is that, first of all, thank you also for all the work that you've put into this. I know how much work goes into this because I'm familiar with zoning bylaws from a past career as a real estate appraiser. What I am concerned about is that it feels like the private small landowner is being asked to protect the heritage and beauty of Huntsville. The heritage and beauty of Huntsville is amazing and, of course, needs to be protected. But, you know, I'm listening to the heritage designation and the fact that it sounds like the private person will be responsible for maintaining that beauty that is so characteristic of Huntsville. And I think, well, what happened to the developers? I think about the question, I guess, that comes to me is, who has altered Huntsville the most? And it isn't the private individual, it's the developer. And the developers are needed. We need development, we need growth, but I often have thought, but why there? And why have we not put a focus, first of all, on, okay, what's the overall vision and beauty of Huntsville and how do we maintain that? And we had a forest within the confines of the urban area of Huntsville that is now gone, right? It was clear cut by Forbes Drive, and there will be high buildings there, which seems out of step with what the character of Huntsville always has been. I happened to have been in Europe the summer that I came back, and I saw what had happened to the site where Home Depot is currently. And when I had the opportunity to go up there and I first saw those hills, I was just stunned. And what came to me right away was, this is as beautiful as the Seven Hills of Rome. I've seen the Seven Hills of Rome more than once, and it is no different. It is as beautiful, as spectacular. But what did we do with that site? We put a warehouse so that not even the people working there and coming to visit can look out of a window. You can be at the parking lot of Tim Hortons to enjoy that view, but wouldn't it have been nicer to have a park? The Italians put a park so that everyone can enjoy the Seven Hills of Rome. I understand that with the conflict with private property and so on, this becomes more difficult. But as an appraiser, I was often asked, what is the highest and best use of that property? And I sometimes think in that category we failed. And I do appreciate that we need to preserve and protect what is beautiful and lovely of Huntsville. But I would like it not to be on the backs of the private, individual landowner. I guess that's all I have to say. Thank you for listening. I appreciate really all the work because it's a very complicated document and there are many conflicting things that have to be looked at. So I am thankful for all the work that's gone into it, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks for being here and for your comments. I don't see anyone else unless, Richard, you still have another question?
I'm thinking about it.
Okay, I do see one more coming down, so.
See, no need for distance. My name's Craig Ward. My ancestry in Huntsville goes back to the early 1800s. I'm related to the Paynes, the Rhinuses, the Whites, and I'm a Ward. Went to school here in Huntsville. A lot of people probably don't like me because I'm a logging contractor, or a former logging contractor, and I still log. Now I'm officially a senior citizen, but I still do it. I am one of the first 3 loggers in all of Ontario who became a certified tree marker through the Ministry of Natural Resources. If you want my credentials, you can talk to anybody from the Algonquin Forestry Authority that knows me, from the Ministry of Natural Resources, or from West Wind Stewardship Council. I was the first logger in Muskoka Prairie Sound to receive an award for stewardship for looking after the environment in Muskoka Prairie Sound. And that was back in 1998. I bought my first skidder in 1990, went to work for Tim back here in town. I used to ask the forest technicians all kinds of questions while I was a logger and wonder why they were doing it, whatever. One of the questions I have is this a bylaw? Is it a tree cutting bylaw? Yes or no?
It is not.
It is not a tree cutting bylaw. But if somebody wants to cut a tree, they got to get a permit. Does that not make it a tree cutting bylaw?
I'm going to either let Richard or Paul just answer that question as far as when you need a permit to cut trees, and I believe...
On your own property. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't own property, I rent, but I have family members who have property. And
Thank you. So through you, Your Worship, so it's not a tree cutting bylaw. There are several exemptions about tree removal, and the tree removal provisions that are in the bylaw, unless exempt, are to deal with areas that are natural constraints, so natural heritage features. So that's how I would answer that question. But there are exemptions for tree removals for, we've already gone through it, but.
yeah. Anyhow, so when you say, okay, so somebody can cut firewood for their own personal use, but say if they wanted to cut a few extra cords of firewood and just sell it on their own property, does that make it commercial?
Yep, so through you, Your Worship, if you want me to answer that, yeah, that would make it commercial, so that would have to be a permitted use. And forestry operations are permitted in the rural area, so the rural precinct, then that would be a permitted use.
Okay, so you can't cut your own trees and sell them to pay some bills. Okay, that's
Nope,
good.
I didn't.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I didn't.
So if somebody phones and complains, who goes and enforces the complaint? Because I heard this gentleman talking about if he went and cut a tree because he thought it was diseased or defective or whatever, and his neighbor complained because he cut the tree, which, in my opinion, tell your neighbor to mind their own business. That's being quite blunt about it. I mean, who owns the land? Who pays the taxes on it? I mean, he talked about he's got 350 acres, and he's had neighbors that went in and basically clear-cut their property. I'm a logger. I don't agree with clear-cutting, not in hardwoods. If you look at old photos of Huntsville around here, back Williamsport, a lot of places, you will see that most of Huntsville, back in the days when it was being homesteaded, was clear-cut. One particularly, I have a photo of my uncle back in Williamsport. If you're ever there, there's the old log home, which was my grandfather's place. And it showed my uncle when he's now 86, I believe, and he was about 3 years old, and the side hill behind him was totally cleared for homesteading and farming and whatever. And when I came around, which was about 30 years later, that whole side hill was forested again, and that particular side hill I know has been logged at least 2 times since then. So I promote sustainable forestry. And if you're going to do forestry, do it. If you don't do forestry on your bush, because I've met a lot of landowners say, I don't want loggers in there, they're destroying the bush. And right from the Ministry of Natural Resources handbook for tree marking, an unmanaged forest is an unhealthy forest. You drive out Highway 60 through Algonquin Park, no logging is allowed within a kilometer of either side of the highway. It looks like a park, but it is not a healthy forest. The trees are not healthy in there. There are healthy trees, but it's called a zero net forest. So for every tree that falls, another one will grow up. Whereas if you manage a forest, everybody's upset about global warming and whatever. If you want to help global warming and you have a bush, have your forest managed and logged sustainably, and it will actually help the environment, and it will get rid of the unhealthy trees in your forest. So. And as far as going in for the bylaw to come in and say if he felled a tree on his property, the neighbor complained about it, and he went in there, and if the tree had a Utapella canker, which is a major disease, and you've probably seen them because the nickname for them is a cobra head canker, the base of the tree would be perfect. So you could not tell by looking at the stump that that was a diseased tree. That particular disease has little microscopic spores that go from tree to tree to tree in a windstorm. And what they do is a frost crack, another tree falls, a branch falls and knocks the bark off that particular tree. Now that spore goes to that tree and it infects that tree. And it's just part of it is, but tree marking, you try to get rid of the worst first, plus you have to do spacing and stuff like that. I guess the question was, who enforces? Sorry, I wonder. Who would enforce that? And what are their credentials for going in and determining that tree was diseased or healthy? Like, do any of them have a history of working in forestry? Or
Can you speak to enforcement, Richard?
Yeah, so real quick, so through your worship, so just to clarify that forest management is exempt. So as Craig pointed out, that's an important part of keeping a forest healthy. So we recognize that, and that's exempt. The enforcement side of things, again, if something is damaged, dead, dying, it's going to be benefit of the doubt. We will, you know, if there's a trail there, there's a house there, and the tree was removed because the landowner thought it could fall on the house, then there's not much we would do about that. We would, and if a neighbor was calling and complaining about those things, then it is difficult to enforce. But that's true for every regulation of tree removal. And I have worked with foresters, and they usually can't enforce those things because there's no evidence. So that does not change as a result of this, and we wouldn't pursue anything if there's no evidence. So from an enforcement perspective, we're not wanting this to cause a whole bunch of new work. But if something does need enforcement, you know, we have staff, bylaw staff that would be able to assist. None of them are forestry professionals, but if that was something that would be needed, then I suppose that would be something that we would get help on on a case-by-case basis if something major happened, if that helps.
Okay. You talked R2 lots. Like, is there a lot?
Sorry, Mr. Ward, can you speak right into the mic,
Oh,
please?
sorry.
I can't hear you.
R2 lots, are rural 2 or whatever it is there a lot size designation, or is it just the location of where it is? Like, would it be like under 10 acres, over 10 acres, or 100 acres? Or is it just the location within the town?
Thank you. Through you, Your Worship. Just to clarify, are you talking about the existing zone, the RU2 zone?
Yeah, you said no logging could take place in a rural 2 area?
Yeah, in a rural 2 zoned property. So those are currently mapped in our zoning bylaw.
Like, are they usually like closer to town or something like that? That's why, or?
No, they're closer to water bodies.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, so you're putting a reserve on a water body. Okay. So back 30 years ago when I first got into the tree mark and whatever, and in the 1970s there was little to no reserves on water bodies, and then we went to, if you get into Algonquin Park, a lot of the reserves are basically like what you're talking about, where they're slope related, because there are places that I've logged on the east side or west side of Algonquin Park to a lot of places up in there. They have reserves on lakes, reserves on canoe routes, reserves on portages, reserves on hiking trails. And basically, most of them are eyesight. If you can see them from the water, you can see them from the trail, there's a reserve on it and whatever. Now, outside of the park, they used to have like 30-meter reserves, sometimes it was 100-meter reserves, and you're talking 150-meter reserves. The only reserves that the M&R really ever put on like that is around hawk's nests, especially osprey nesting sites, heron rookeries. To put a blanket reserve on waterways is 150 meters, which is roughly, what, 500 feet. That's pretty extensive. The M&R has, in the last 5 years, through a lot of research and study, have actually reduced the reserves to the point where I have actually, because I operate a feller buncher for a local company, I think they took it a little bit too far, because I have actually literally reached out with the arm of the buncher and cut trees right on the bank of the stream. One for fisheries and stuff like that, and we're allowed to go closer to ponds. Now, when you say reserves on waterways, are we talking beaver ponds or lakes or rivers or cold water streams, intermittent streams? Or is it just any waterway?
Richard?
Thank you, through you, Your Worship. So I guess just to maybe help with the understanding of this, it's not, this 150-meter area is not just about the ecological sensitivities. It is also about maintaining character within the waterfront area. So I think I understand what you're saying about these reserve areas, and you know, you're raising that sometimes they're not big enough, sometimes they're too big. But in this instance, it's also about character of the waterfront area. So we're just saying around, and this is an OP policy, around our water bodies, which are anything that's over 8 hectares is considered a water body. We have this area where we want to make sure that we're looking at maintaining waterfront character in those areas.
It's not river, or is it rivers or bigger rivers?
There is, it is in the official plan. It does say the Big East River is one of them. Yeah. And I can't remember all of them, but it is defined in the official plan.
Okay. So the other thing is that if you're talking like beaver ponds and stuff like that, if you're applying to beaver ponds, if you don't allow any forestry to take place in the vicinity of beaver ponds, the beaver's going to leave, because they don't like to cut the big trees. They like the small saplings and stuff like that. And we actually had this discussion with West Wind, M&R, AFA over the years about this, because if you're going to forbid forestry going down to some of these, I can see it on the bigger lakes and stuff like that, because we're a tourist area. I love seeing the big trees too. But if you're getting into the little ponds, you got to remember the different wildlife that's there as well, because there's otters, but especially the beavers. The beavers, anyhow. Enough of that one.
Mr. Ward, I'm going to thank you for those comments now. We've been really lenient on time, and so I'm going to go to the next speaker, and you can come back. Okay?
I might have. I think I've pretty much got it all. I'm proud to live in Huntsville. I've always been proud of Huntsville. One quick question. These people that did this clear cutting here, did they have approval before they did the clear cutting? Or did they just do it and then go get building permits afterwards?
Yeah, that's part of the reason why we're trying to put the CPP in place.
Okay, because to me, if they clear cut like behind the arena there, if they clear cut that and didn't have permission to build, don't give them a friggin' building permit. It's that simple. Make them reforest the cursed thing. Because them people make me look bad, because everybody looks at that, because I remember the picture that was in the Forester saying, look what the loggers did. The developers hire the logger because that's our job, but we're paid to do what we're paid to do. But it's not us, not all loggers. Some loggers do clear cut, but most of the ones that I associate with don't. And these high rises, they're disgusting.
Thanks. Next, who's next down there?
Got another question for the panel here. I don't want anybody to think I'm anti-Huntsville. I absolutely love our town. I'm not anti-council. I'm not anti-town of Huntsville. But does this bylaw apply to the town of Huntsville? Like, does the town of Huntsville, if they want to go ahead and initiate a project that they want to go ahead and clear cut trees, do they have to seek council's approval? Or is it kind of back roads because they're the town, they don't have to? And does this apply to the district council? If district wants to come in and do a district project, do they have to seek the town of Huntsville approval?
Richard, do we have to follow the process?
So through you, Your Worship, so There are exemptions for public works that have that are to occur, and basically the exemption is only if it's gone through an environmental assessment or an equivalent environmental study. So there are environmental assessment processes that public bodies have to follow if they're going to be putting in major infrastructure works. And so what we said is if a public body does an environmental assessment, then it could be exempt from this, or an equivalent study. So if they did environmental work, if there was a wetland, that piece of infrastructure was going in and they studied it, then they could be exempt. But they would have to do some sort of environmental investigations. So if that helps.
Kind of does. I think that if we're asking our private citizens to follow the rules, then we should also ask that of our town to follow the rules. We ask a lot of our residents in Huntsville. I think it's fair to ask the same of our public town when we do projects. So that's what I had to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Who's next?
So I have a question. Do you have to approve this CP bylaw before the end of 2022?
Richard? Is there something about it has to be approved within 2 years of the what?
Yeah.
I can't
Yeah.
remember.
So through you, Your Worship, that is correct. There is a Planning Act provision requirement that says when you've done an official plan, within 3 years of that official plan, you're supposed to bring your zoning bylaw into compliance. So we're not doing a zoning bylaw amendment. We're doing this community planning permit bylaw. So yeah, there's 3 years from when your official plan was updated, and ours was updated in 2019.
Right.
And I think it was finally approved by the district towards the end of 2019. So yeah, that's what we're working towards, if that helps answer that question.
Okay. So if it doesn't get passed with this council, it probably won't go through because is the election not in October, sort of thing?
Yeah, so through you, Your Worship. So no matter what, if it didn't get passed by that time, you still have to bring your zoning bylaws or your community planning bylaws into compliance with your official plan.
But would you have to start the process over again though? Because you've exceeded the 3-year time frame.
No, you wouldn't. The Planning Act has these timing horizons for municipalities to hit, and the municipalities will do the best they can to do that. And it's always good practice when you have an official plan to make sure that you're implementing bylaws, are working to implement it. But I think it's recognized that these things do take time, so it's not like you'd have to throw it out if you didn't meet that timeline.
Okay. Okay, and I just have one final statement. So my husband and myself, we formally request that there be more public open house meetings, that the town provide more ways of providing the public with knowledge of this new CP bylaw, and the passing be postponed until more input has been received by the public, that rural landowners should be considered as stakeholders in this proposal to avoid repercussions in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, Richard.
With luck, I'll be the last one. And I've got 5 minutes. One thing I missed early on was where to, apply is not the right word, but where to indicate that I want more notifications of upcoming meetings and et cetera. Somebody gave a website or an address or something, and I only got part of it written down.
No, you want the email?
I don't use email, so I want the address or the phone number where someone can call me and say there's a meeting on this date or whatever. Or were you not thinking about notifying the people who say, notify me? I'm confused there.
Yeah, so all you'd have to do is put in writing in your comments to us that you would like to receive notification. And please, if it's not digital notification, then please specify that so that we can accommodate you on that.
Okay, just wanted to make sure that I understood that. I'll just make some general overall comments since everybody has kind of said a lot of this before. I think there needs to be more consultation. And as you make revisions, make those available so we can read them. Since the last changes come out, I haven't had time to go through it again. So we need more time before this is approved. My overall comments about this whole bylaw thing, and I'm talking not just about how it affects me on a waterfront backlot, which used to be rural, but about all the other ones too, the waterfronts and how big your dock has to be and where you can put your dry boathouse and all that sort of stuff. Put all these together, it seems like a lot of the effort that is going into this permit bylaw is aimed at what I could call prettification, trying to make it more scenic and more beautiful and not paying a whole lot of attention to those of us who live here and work here, and seem to cater more to making it look nice for the waterfront residents who come here seasonally or who live here all year round. And if that's the goal, then please stay away from the euphemisms like maintaining the character of the waterfront, maintaining the ecosystem. Just be upfront about it. The goal is to protect the scenery. And then once you've done that, then compensate those landowners who are having various uses taken away from their property in order to maintain the beauty and the ecosystem, or however euphemism you want to use. Compensate them some way, whether it's through a reduced assessment category of some sort, because otherwise you're expecting the private landowners whose land is having its uses restricted in this bylaw bear the cost for the benefit of others, namely the waterfront residents and those passing through. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Violet, I'm going to give you one last question, and then we're going to council's.
All right, I promise, last question. So let's say I'm zoned, like currently I'm zoned for my property, like with where we live, we're zoned light industrial, and then all of a sudden we're zoned to, I don't know, some other zoning. Is there a way like we could seek like a zoning exemption to that, like within like, or is it like grandfather claused? I just kind of missed that part, so I just would like some clarification on that.
Richard, I'll turn that over to you.
I'm through you, Your Worship. I am sorry. I didn't get all of your question. If you could ask it again, I'll try my best.
Just asking, like, if we are like rezoned somewhere or put into like a different precinct for this purpose, are we grandfathered in? Like, we have a business on our property, like as we're allowed to do under the zoning. If we aren't, like, if we're zoned in, can we seek an exemption to that, or are we able to just be grandfathered in from the previous zoning of light industrial?
Thank you. So through you, Your Worship. So I think what you're describing is what we would call a legal non-conforming use. So if there's a change to any bylaw and you were using your property for one thing prior to that bylaw changing, then you would have a legal non-conforming use and you could continue to use your property in accordance with that use. And then there are provisions in this community planning permit bylaw if you wanted to change that use, or say if it burnt down or anything like that, there is provisions about that Really, it's expanding a non-conforming use that there may be issues with, and there are official plan policies that would guide us in determining what expansions would be appropriate or not.
But like if this was passed tomorrow, this was passed tomorrow, we don't have to do anything to say we're still wanting to operate our business, that nothing's changed about it other than the town passed a community planning bylaw.
Yeah, the one caveat, just so everyone's aware, is obviously that use would have to be lawfully established. So that use that you're doing on your property would have to be a lawfully established use in accordance with the rules that exist right now. So that would be the only caveat. But yes, as long as that's in place, it's a legal non-conforming use, and you can continue to do that.
Okay, thank you, and I promise that's the last question.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for being here tonight. I'm going to open it up now to council for questions of Richard or our consultants.
This gentleman over here talked about anybody with a chainsaw coming in and could go logging. Tim, if you grab a chainsaw and go cut on your property, no restrictions, no laws, no nothing. If you pick it up commercially, you got to have proof of training. And if you're going to be a logger, I'm a certified trainer through Workplace Safety North. I'm constantly doing training courses, because if you see a logger come on any property, whether if they're logging and they're doing clear cutting on your town property or whatever, they have to be certified. They have to have proof of certification. They have to have proof of training. So anybody that comes into anywhere, private land, crown land, wherever, they have to have proof of training. And if they're not certified, the Ministry of Labor will shut them down on the spot.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Alcock.
Thank you, Your Worship. I won't be long. I wanted to thank everybody for a lot of really great comments and questions. I've been diligently taking many pages of notes, and I'm certainly hearing loud and clearly that everyone would like to see a third draft and would like to see it shared, would like to see a copy in the library. I think that's a great suggestion. And for those who aren't online and do use a library or that sort of thing. So lots of good comments. And and I hear that there are lots of issues around need for further clarification and understanding what the definitions are, or maybe need for more definitions, because a lot of questions seem to be related to that. My first question, I have a couple, but the first one is in reference to a developer who needs to do a number of studies and could be exempt. And it's kind of related to a number of other clarification questions. What type of guidelines do we have, or criteria that would say how much tree removal needs to take place in order to do those studies? And I'm thinking of a couple of personal experiences where we've heard of a developer going in and clearing more than what people in the area think is necessary. So rightly or wrongly, do we have guidelines for a developer as to what they can remove?
So through you, Your Worship, so it's a great question. So in a situation like that, it's not so much guidelines, it's tests that are in our official plan. So if you were going to be doing something like that, then you would have to be in conformity with our official plan. And if there was something significant on the property, like a wetland, you would have to be outside that wetland. If there were other features like, significant wildlife habitat, you would have to demonstrate that what you're doing is going to have no negative impact on that. So what we typically ask for in a situation like that is an environmental impact study. So the environmental impact study is done by a qualified professional. They look at a property, they say what's sensitive on the property, what needs to be protected, how it should be protected, what are the limits, what buffers need to be maintained from those features. So that's, I guess, in essence, what provides the guidelines to that developer, if that helps.
It does. Thank you, Richard. I guess, though, in saying that, we've had cases where a developer might go in and it's saying in our permit that they're exempt if they're going in to get material for studies, right? For exactly the studies you're talking about. So we're assuming then that they know that information before, let's say it's before they've done the environmental assessment. Or in fact, it could be in preparation for the environmental assessment. So I'm wondering, is there a guideline just for that preliminary first step?
Okay. So through you, Your Worship, thank you. And when you put it that way, I see what you're getting at. So there is nothing like a guideline. The current exemption says that if you're doing field reconnaissance in support of a development application,
right,
and you needed to get equipment in, I mean, this is the scenario, you needed to get equipment in there to do that work, then it would be exempt. So other than that, though, there is no specific criteria. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. At least I know the answer. I'm wondering if we might give a little thought to what that might look like, but or not. And a quick follow-up, if I may.
You may.
Yeah, thank you. So the next one is very simple, and I think you alluded to it earlier, but certainly it was referenced a couple of times from the audience, and that was if I look at the Summit development, which was approved, the zoning was approved several councils ago. So it gave us very little control as to what was happening. But if this bylaw had been in place as they were proceeding with the development in the last couple of years, would they have been allowed to clear cut the way they did?
So, through you, Your Worship, that's a great question, and no, they wouldn't. If this was in place, all of the studies, we would need to see them. They would need to be prepared by qualified professionals, and they would need to be prepared to our satisfaction, and we wouldn't allow that type of removal to occur unless that happened. So this is very much what this is trying to control.
And that's what I had thought. So I really appreciate that answer. Thank you.
Councillor Stone?
Sorry. Two things. First, a comment and a question. So the first one is with the shortened timeline for approvals and no notification to the neighbors, that's quite a concern for me. And just advising to go to our website to find the information is a ridiculous suggestion unless they know to go and look. I think perhaps a much larger sign than we actually post now. We have some pink signs that are about a 1.5 feet wide by 3 feet long perhaps, but I think we need to make perfectly clear that to the neighbors that something is happening or coming to the property. My question is, what's the penalty if someone clears before getting approval, whether that be private or industrial?
So through you, Your Worship, so that's a great question. So the penalties are outlined in the Planning Act. And so there's a difference between a corporation violating those provisions versus a private individual. And I can't offhand recall what there would be fines under the Planning Act provisions, but I can't remember the amounts. But it would be treated as a Planning Act violation. And there's a section of the Planning Act that describes how those would be, or what the penalties are for that.
Thanks.
Councillor Schumacher?
Thank you, through you, Your Worship, to Richard or Kirsten. I pretty much have asked this of you guys, so I just want to get a clarity out there. I've had a number, obviously being a councillor in a rural area, a number of concerns, and I do appreciate that you have taken the time to look at the exemption pieces. A lot of hunt camp owners have reached out to me to make sure that the recreational use piece is what's covered for them for hunting, clearing trails. They want to be able to still hunt in their area, have runways, all of those types of things. And so again, I guess that is under the recreational use piece is my understanding. And hopefully, yes, neighbors aren't complaining about that. That is their personal use and what they do with their property, correct? Is that the recreational use piece?
So yes, through you, Your Worship, there is an exemption that deals with forest operations, forest management, and so recreational trails is under that exemption. The definition of forest management would specify what is included in forest management, and recreational trails is one of the items.
Perfect, yes, and they may have a certified person, as Mr. Ward had said, come in and do some of that work for them, so that is great. And then lastly, again, like Councillor Alcock said, I appreciate everybody coming out. I appreciate the emails that I think we've all received and the feedback, and it's great. I hear you do want a third draft as well, and I do appreciate the idea of having a copy in the library for people to see. And I guess lastly, again, to sort of the same comment as Councillor Alcock had said, if this plan were in place before, we wouldn't see things like developments in sort of my areas of Port Sydney and Utterson, where people start to do maybe the work on subdivisions and whatnot, and you see clear cutting of like a whole entire road has happened possibly before the actual permits and things in place. So with this in place, it would stop seeing a whole entire road being created before the next steps. They'd need to get this permit in order to do that, correct? Thank you. Thanks, Richard.
Councillor Wiebe?
Thank you, Worship. I've got a couple of them. The first one is I want to circle back to one of the comments from the audience, and it had to do with reestablishing farmland. And my sense is that any grounds that have been left for a number of years will start to grow in, but I think there's going to be, I think in our future, we're going to see more people wanting to reestablish farmland in order to increase home production of vegetables, et cetera. So I'm wondering if no matter what, the permit does still apply if it doesn't meet the number of acres or hectares that you can clear cut. But then the follow-up really is, what would the permitting process look like if someone were to approach and say, listen, I want to reestablish these 10 acres. We're going to need to clear cut them back to the way they were in 1970. What would, if that came across the town of Huntsville's desk, per se, what would that process look like?
So through you, Your Worship, so that would be, assuming it's in a natural constraint area,
right.
So that would be a Class 2 variation. So the idea would be, it's a staff approval, the notice, the property would be posted. There's a great chart in the bylaw that describes the process.
Okay.
So it would start with pre-consultation. In practice, what we would do is we would talk to that landowner about their property, about what our mapping says is the most sensitive portions of their property. You know, you can see a lot in aerial photos. You can see a lot on site visits. I mean, if it's new successional growth, you know, we might direct them in that area. If there's like a wetland on the property, we might tell them, stay 30 meters away from that. So what we would always do with a landowner is we would give them our first impressions on what you could do on your property to avoid having to do any studies. So if you did this over 1 hectare of clear cutting to reestablish this forest, or sorry, this farm field, in this area, we could issue a class 2 variation without needing a study.
Right.
However, if you wanted to do it anywhere close to that wetland or outside of that early successional growth, then we think you need to do a study. So kind of they have to make up their mind about whether or not they want to avoid the study or go through with the study process. If they do the study and it says that that can be established there without any negative impacts, you know, we would look at that. And if that can occur, then they would be able to proceed. There would be recommendations, I'm sure, in that study about how to mitigate impacts. And the Class 2 variation, they would get a Class 2 permit, and it could have conditions in it on how to implement those recommendations.
Okay.
So that's kind of how I would see that scenario going forward. And we would always work with a landowner to avoid having to do the study. But if for whatever reason they wanted to proceed and do the study, then that option would be available to them. The whole point of the pre-consultation is to try and explain to them, you know, what permit path they're going to go down, what studies they might have to do if they decided to, you know, build in one spot or do the reestablishment of the field in another spot. And we would, pre-consultation is where we give them that direction.
Okay.
So I hope that helps.
That does help. Can I, I've got one more if I could.
You can have one more, yes.
Thank you. My other question is around trees that would be considered, I guess, non-native or perhaps invasive. What comes to mind is like a Scots pine, which we see everywhere. Chances are it was planted deliberately. How would we govern the exemption process around that if someone wanted to essentially clear cut something like a planted tree that wasn't native, that I think most foresters would say you probably should, it was probably a bad idea to plant it there in the first place. So I'm wondering what the process would be around an item like that.
So through you, Your Worship, so yeah, it's a great question. So not all woodlands are created equal. Some are invasive species, some are early successional. You know, not all of us are going to know what an invasive species is or what isn't. On staff, we do have some knowledge of invasive species. There's excellent materials out there about Invasive Species Ontario, from Invasive Species Ontario. If something was an invasive woodland, then that would go into our consideration. And, you know, if you're going over the one hectare, then, you know, it might be that you still need to do a study, it might not, but it would be considered by us if it is invasive.
Right.
That's all I could say about that. But it is very case specific. A woodland that has invasive species in it is still a woodland. It still is habitat.
Right.
It's still providing buffering functions to water courses. So it's not as simple as just saying it's invasive, get rid of it.
Right.
It's dependent on, you know, what's using that species, that woodland. So there is, I guess that it's a bit case specific.
Right, so I guess the pre-consultation again would be pretty key. Okay, thanks for that.
Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for the presentation and all the great questions from those attending here tonight. The question I have is with regards to time limits, with regards to developments. I know in discussion, in a joint discussion we had with the District of Muskoka and Commissioner Hastings, the suggestion was made that if someone puts forward a plan for development and it's not acted, it has to be acted on within 10 years, or then it becomes null and void. Are there provisions in this particular bylaw or for putting a time limit on developments like that? And I'm really pleased to hear that if the clear cutting that we've seen, and I think we were all devastated by what we saw in Conroy Park, but that could have been avoided had this bylaw been in place. Is that what I'm led to understand? I think that's what I heard from Deputy Mayor. That would be so good to hear, because that was shocking to me, and I had no idea that was happening. But with regards to the timelines, is there provisions in this particular bylaw for a development to be acted on or be completed, or at least started within a particular period of time? Thank you.
Through you, Madam Worship, there are no timelines in the Planning Act for zoning or anything under a CPP bylaw. So once the zoning's in place, if a landowner doesn't build a home in accordance with the zoning, there's no time limitations. There is time limitations you can put on a draft plan of subdivision and have a deeming provision to take that draft plan of subdivision away, but not for zoning or CPP bylaw under the Planning Act.
So further to that then, so at this point then, Richard, this bylaw then does not provide us with timeline provisions with regards to acting?
Through your worship, we're just going to double check on when you actually grab a permit or get a permit if there's a time limit under the Planning Act, and we're just going to search that up. But that's a good question. We're just going to clarify that if we can find it. If we not, Richard will get through to you on and council on that.
Councillor Withey, I can't see you, but if you have a question, now's your opportunity.
I'm okay, thanks.
Okay. All right. So I'm just going to make actually a couple of comments, and I'm not sure they're going to be all that popular, at least with our staff. We've been listening as council to complaints about clear cutting, development clear cutting, almost as long as I've been on council. I think I've been hearing that. And the whole idea of a community planning permit, when I heard about it and the way it worked, was to address that very item, to stop, for lack of a better word, the raping of our forests for developments. And one of the other big pieces was also clear cutting or just wiping out waterfront trees. So when we started this, I thought that we would end up with a community planning permit that would stop the clear cutting of developers and would protect our waterfronts. It was never my intent to be pursuing a tree cutting bylaw, and I never really thought in terms of putting a lot of restrictions on our rural areas and on individual landowners. I think Larry Ross made a good point that we may have so many rules in this bylaw that we will indeed be hiring 3 or 4 new people to sit and answer the phone. And I'm not sure that that's where we want to go. So I guess my question is there a way to relax some of the rules, and is there a way to relax some of what we're trying to do in the rural areas that we just maybe don't really need to do?
So through you, Your Worship, so we heard that loud and clear on the first draft. So we did get a lot of feedback about, we think in the urban area it makes sense to prevent clear cutting, but in the rural area there needs to be different rules. The way we changed the bylaw, we felt in the first draft that there were already exemptions that would ensure that there's not going to be an impact on rural livelihoods and the way people enjoy their rural properties. In the second draft, we made it really clear that those exemptions trump. So if you have an exemption, there's nothing you need to worry about. This bylaw doesn't apply for you. So we tried to really clarify that. We also heard that it was clear cutting that people were more concerned with. So we introduced that language into the exemption for rural areas. There are rules for rural areas that really do try and, as you say, ensure that it's not going to be an overburdensome bylaw. So we think that we've achieved that, and it could be that that's just something that education materials are going to help enforce for people, that there are all sorts of exemptions for rural landowners, that this isn't something that's going to impact them in any way. That's all I can say is we did hear that loud and clear, and we have made several changes to address it. And we think through those changes, the focus is correct, and it's on those sensitive lands, it's on regulating those urban areas, and making sure that all of the exemptions that we heard are needed in the rural area are in there, and they're really clear that those all apply. So that's all I could say to that one.
I thank you for that, and I do appreciate the number of changes that have been made from draft 1 to draft 2, and I know many of them were because of what you heard from the rural people. I feel that we're still hearing that we haven't quite got it right, and I don't know whether a third draft of the bylaw is what we need, or if we just need to address some of the specific areas that we're being asked about. And I realize that would be a third draft, but I mean, we're not talking about redrafting the whole thing. I guess my final question would be, how are we going to deal now going forward with the questions we've heard tonight, and the ones that have been written in, and there are many of those as well?
Okay, so thank you, through you, Your Worship. So yeah, if there are any additional comments about specific changes that need to occur, I mean, the short answer is the exemptions are already there. So there is some of these concerns we're hearing about, the exemptions are there. But if there are specific issues with those exemptions, then comments, we'll put together a comment matrix, and we can identify how we've addressed those specific issues. So I think that's how we can address those. And it was always our intent to have a third draft. So so there is another draft, a final draft.
The final, yeah.
Yeah, and so if there are any comments that people still have, we can address those, and they would be addressed in the final draft.
Just finally, I see you, Deputy Mayor, but so once we do get our final draft, there is a final public meeting to present it, correct? No, there's not. So the final draft is presented only to council? I think Director Maxwell might take that one.
Thank you, Your Worship. There's no statutory requirement to hold, there was no statutory requirement to hold this public meeting either.
Sorry, Kirsten, I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. There's no statutory requirement to hold any additional public meetings, but if council wants to direct staff to hold an additional public meeting, we would do so with the release of the third draft. However, as Richard alluded to, any comments that we've received would be added into our table, and how we will address that comment will also be included, as we did with the comments we've received to date, and then part of the agenda package.
Thanks. Deputy Mayor?
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll be really quick. Just to follow up on your last comment, and to Richard, and maybe it isn't obviously a rewrite of the whole thing, but in the third draft, really providing more clarity, as you did tonight, right? There were a number of questions on lack of understanding as to what some of the exemptions were referring to. And I think a number of the questions you were saying, no, that's exempt. So maybe it's just providing more clarity and more explanation as to where the exemptions work, and, you know, being as clear as possible. Sometimes, as we all know, planners, we all get caught up in planning language, right? And it's the job to make it really, really simple and really clear so that all of us can understand it. That's, to me, I think that would go a long way.
Okay, I think that was a good meeting, and I think I now say, now that all comments have been received, I declare this public meeting to be concluded. And with that, I want to sincerely thank those of you who took the time to come out, those of you who have taken time to write in and sit through all this. I have a resolution moved by somebody who's not here. Let's fix that. I have a resolution moved by Councillor Stone and seconded by Deputy Mayor Alcock. Be it resolved that Confirmation Bylaw 2022-70 be received, numbered, and read a first, second, and third time, and finally passed this 26th day of April 2022. All in favor? And that carries. And I have a resolution moved by Councillor Withey and seconded by Councillor Stone that we do now adjourn at 8:32 p.m. All in favor? And that carries.